virtual studio, that is, with Wade Fransson, and we're here to talk predominantly about his book, but as we do with many authors and public intellectuals, we want to focus on the themes of the book and not give away too many of the juicy details. Is that right, Wade?
Yeah, and at the same time, my book is chock full of so many juicy details. Mm-hmm. I have no problem giving a few away.
All right. So, well, I mean, let's first off talk about, what's going on in the world of Wade today and lately since we've talked in the last month.
Well, it's interesting. I just came from a meeting where I had sort of coffee with an intern who works at Kohl's department stores where I work. The intern, is 21 and he happens to live in my city. And because of the pandemic, he's able to work. And so I got to spend an hour with him telling about the kind of work that I do professionally. And of course, in explaining how I do that work, some of the information and material from my book played into that. And he, kind of kept peppering me with questions about that. So we actually ended up talking about my trilogy quite a bit as well. And it was interesting. So I feel like my head's in the right space for this discussion today.
Right on. So then, yeah, I mean, for anybody that doesn't know, it's if they rushed out to the store and they bought this particular book, they'd be quite happy with the fact that there's another two books. Either I think one's already published and the third one's on the way. Is that how it is?
They've all three been published actually, and they are designed to work as standalone books. And some have imbibed of them that way. But I actually kind of wonder, the take that somebody would take by reading, one of them individually, because each one covers similar material, but in a very different way. And they definitely build on each other and expand on the whole purpose and message of why I bothered writing any of it down in the first place.
Okay, let's reveal some of that. Some of that impetus / wellspring.
Well, so I guess one place to start is that why did I write this book? There are many answers to that I can honestly discuss, in a number of given situations. But there was one trigger where I realized I had to write this book. Initially, it was just going to be one book. And that is that the book is autobiographical, but it can't really be pegged down to an autobiography or a memoir, because I sought to completely transcend that genre by writing something of universal appeal that doesn't actually depend on any of the circumstances in my book. I mean, one comparison might be that book, A River Runs Through It. If you're familiar with that, it's a story of a man and his brother, and it's an actual true life story, and it's in the Northwest, up in your neck of the woods, so to speak. I think just south of the border, actually. But by the way, I guess everybody knows you're in the British Columbia area. Yeah. But I don't know if you've ever read that book or seen the movie. I did both, and it's just universal in this situation between these two brothers, that it completely transcends the telling of the story. And I sought to achieve something like that with my work. But so why did I bother, or what was the trigger to get me to actually start writing? It was while I was in Europe doing work. Actually, at that point in time, I was studying the fifth language that I can speak. And it's the one that I'm absolutely worst at. It's Russian. So I can't really claim to speak it. I dabble in Russian. But I was studying Russian. I speak 4 other languages. And I was doing work behind the Iron Curtain. And at that point in time, the circumstances and experiences of my life had been so utterly bizarre that almost anyone I met, there was some connection where I could relate to them and have a discussion about my experiences and their experiences. But 3 times in a period of 6 months, I had different people stop me in the middle of a discussion, say, you're just lying. You're making this stuff up. You're a pathological liar. And I was shocked, right, that somebody would deny my experience. I'll use some woke language here, that somebody would deny my truth, right? When in fact, this is not just my interpretation, but the actual facts of my life were being denied. And it was at that point in time that I realized I had to write this down, names, dates, and places, not in the context of a story based on real events, but literally names, dates, and places, so that if anybody, and this was actually in the pre-Google world, but the equivalent of Google as it existed then, if anyone researched it, they would know that everything I put in that book is absolutely true. So that was the trigger of it. And the reason I share that at the beginning is the circumstances were so bizarre that it is literally unbelievable for many people. And I've been told that what I was saying was a lie when it's the absolute truth. So the tidbit that I'll share here is that this whole journey really started when my Swedish father and my British Canadian-born mother were living in the United States, which was my father's dream, to get to the big country out west. And I was 8 years old and they divorced. And my mother was awarded full custody. And my father showed up one day while my mother was at work, telling the babysitter that he was taking his kids to the mall. He just didn't tell her that the mall was in Sweden. And he smuggled me and my two sisters out of the country and separated us with 3 sets of aunts and uncles. And we were separated from both parents for 2 years and from each other. And because my father had to go back to Alaska, where he was working, to earn the money to pay for what now became an international court battle that literally went to the Supreme Court of Sweden, at which point in time my dad lost custody. So that, rather unique experience so affected the path of my life that from then on, I was an outsider wherever I went. I was a person who didn't really fit in or belong anywhere from a number of perspectives, including not really having a sense of home or belonging as to what family or where was my family, or even what nationality or language was mine. My younger sister, while we were in Sweden, she forgot English entirely. And then when she came back to the US, she later forgot Swedish entirely. That was one way in which she sort of adapted to her situation, which is by forgetting and denying these other experiences. I was on the opposite end. I retained them perhaps at a deep level. I couldn't in any way erase them. They became part of who I was consciously with full awareness, but it made me different from anybody I was ever with. And I began arguing for socialism, coming from a happy experience in Sweden, in a socialist country at the time when Sweden was considered the humanitarian superpower. And now I'm in the capitalist superpower and the world's policeman. And I'm arguing for a socialist system way back in, the 70s in 6th grade with people who understood even less than I understood about what socialism really was or capitalism really was. But that was the kind of experience I had. And after that, as I tell people, my life began to get weird. That was like the tip of the iceberg. And from then things get really weird. And that's really where the idea of the sign comes in, because religion enters in through my father, and a very fervent belief system that many would label as a cult, certainly cult-ish, in which the observance of certain biblical laws was a sign between the people who observed them and God. And it made those people unique on the planet, in that God was working directly with those people and only with those people directly. He might be working indirectly with everybody, but he was directly working with this group to accomplish his purpose. So that enters in, and that's where the sign in the title comes from. So you might say at the outset, the book certainly deals with identity, but deep issues of identity that go way beyond the typical coming of age story. Some have called it a coming of age story, at least in the first half of the first book. But it goes deep into what identity means and is, and asks a lot of questions, not directly, but it implies those questions. And the reader, through what really is a rollicking story and a people have written various reviews about how much they love the page turning quality, and they've stayed up all night reading, and they can relate, even though it's very weird and strange what's happening to this kid. Ultimately, it's begging a lot of questions about who you are, why you believe you have the identity that you have, and what are some other identities, and what makes you the same as other people or different from other people. And how do you navigate and negotiate through all that? Page after page, questions are being raised because of the almost surreal and unbelievable circumstances that are nonetheless very real.
Right. All right. Well, let's. I want to continue on that thread of the book, but I'm also very curious about your experience in Sweden from a citizen standpoint in a socialist country. We in Canada we have a lot of social programs as well, but would you say that the American populace is their fears of socialism are pretty much unfounded, or do you have any criticisms for socialist countries in terms of, I guess, the systems that they support and propagate?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's a really complex one in my opinion. One of the reasons I was arguing for socialism was simply my childish association of my personal experience with the characteristics of the whole nation. The two really had no direct correlation. So from a scientific or a scholarly perspective, come on, what correlation is there between my experiences as an 8-year-old kidnap victim and the social policies of the country I happened to land in? You follow me?
Yeah.
So it was a very ignorant, childlike, naive view that I had. And it was also, I was completely wrapped around the axle in terms of coming back and defending myself. I remember in the middle of 6th grade, the teacher stood me up in the middle of the class and said, "Here's our new boy from Sweden." And my reaction was, "I'm not from Sweden, I'm an American." But then people came up and said, "Oh, speak Swedish, speak Swedish." And my reaction was, "I'm not your monkey. I'm not going to perform for you." Because I was angry and hurt and bitter already, at age 12 now, or 11 still, whatever, 12, 11, 12, somewhere in there. So then I adapted this self-defense of defending who and what I was as a Swede, and I'm one of you, but I don't agree with you and I don't like you or your system, so there's all this going on. And that's why I said with people who knew even less about socialism than I did. You follow me?
Yeah.
Having said that, Sweden was way advanced over America in many ways. And I think I somehow in my childlike naivete intuitively realized that Sweden was a more child safe, protective environment than the United States. And let me give you an example. This has maybe something to do with socialism versus capitalism, but it's only one thin, narrow slice of it. In Sweden, it was forbidden to advertise to children. It's illegal to create advertisements that are targeting or directing children. This is viewed as a form of child abuse or exploitation. In fact, a few years later, the movie E.T. came out. E.T. was banned in Sweden because of its frightening sequences for children, including the use of guns in chasing the children. When the cops are out after the kids that are protecting E.T. So Sweden very much provides that cocoon nanny state thing that some people are so terrified about, but actually is very beneficial to children to protect them. I believe that one of the greatest, most grievous sins, if you will, of Western style democracy is the way in which it exploits and exposes its children to exploitation in all kinds of ways. In our country, so let's take the example of childcare. In Sweden, you do have universal childcare because they were way ahead of, enabling all mothers to work and making sure that there was good childcare. Whereas in America, the TV becomes your child care, and that's the conduit to rip a gaping hole in the soul of children by, before they have any defense mechanisms, ripping a hole in their heart and telling them, you need this product, you need this piece of crap, whatever I'm trying to sell you, you need it to be happy, you need it to be well adjusted, you need it to have friends, all the, and literally billions of dollars are poured into psychological research to rip that hole in the psyche of those kids and make them dependent on whatever exploitation you happen to be pursuing at that moment. I'm speaking very powerfully here, but I'm not exaggerating. I may be dramatically emphasizing for effect, but what I'm saying is true. And Sweden protects children from that. So on that issue, I would say socialism head and shoulders above American style capitalism on a very extremely important topic. The fear that people have, I think, legitimately, is when you take Swedish socialism and then you make Sweden a member of the EU, and now you have a super state of non-elected officials that is seeking to govern and restrict, in the form of regulation, all aspects of life and human behavior. And then for me, a very deeply religious and spiritual person, you take God out of the picture and you begin denying people religious beliefs, and you begin elevating certain belief systems over others, and you begin censoring people with certain viewpoints in the interests of the state.
Hey, Wade.
However well intended, that's where you jump the shark, and why some people, whether they think it through to this level or not, why they are terrified of socialism.
I didn't get the jump to EU and how that things kind of just went haywire and fell apart there.
Yeah. So let me put it this way. I'm going to paint with some broad brushstrokes here. In the mid 1850s, you had Karl Marx, and you had him declaring religion as the opiate of the people, and you had the basis and the foundation of socialism being established, and you had that thing which again many conservatives in America are really uptight about, which is what today they call a version of critical race theory, in which you're pitting races, or you're pitting classes against each other. And again, I'm mixing some things up here, but I'm trying to go back in history and also keep it current, right? So maybe you have to do a little bit of to refer to Steven Spielberg again, who did E.T. Now we're talking about Back to the Future. You have to put your time travel on and go back to the 1840s and then jump back to the future and see how this stuff morphs and plays out. But in the middle, you have European style socialism. Then you have the United States of America, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and in the middle, you have the European Union. Why am I painting these three pictures? Well, each one is the evolution of society and civilization. Each one is the aggregation of people and social and governmental structures, such that in the United States, you have 50 nations that have become one, e pluribus unum. And I say nations because a state in the 1800s was a nation. And when we started having these states, they viewed themselves as nations. You follow me?
Yeah.
And, you had the state of Germany, the state of England, and the state of, Delaware or whatever, right? And then on the other side, you had, this more coercive system of capture, control, and domination in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, whereas in America, they voluntarily came together. Each one established some form of a federal government to manage these states. And in America, you have this separation of powers, and you have the Bill of Rights and certain freedoms that are enshrined in it. And then you have this thing called one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Poo-poo that all you want. That was the foundation of this United States of America. And then over in the Soviet Union, you have the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and we all know some of the history of that, and Stalin and the pogroms, and 20 million of his own citizens brutally murdered. The United States had a civil war, but it was nothing like what the Soviet Union had. Now you have the European Union, which is some kinder, gentler version of the Soviet Union and some less free and more restrictive version of America. And one might say, well, that's the Goldilocks, perfect size bowl, the Goldilocks story where there was a little chair, a big chair, and the one that was perfect. And there was a little bowl of porridge and a big bowl of porridge, and the one was perfect. Well, maybe the EU, right, could be that perfect mix. But there are those in America who see even in our democracy freedoms being eroded that are precious to them. They see a dominant political ideology gaining sway and control and seeking to change and undermine the Constitution that guarantees freedom. And that's where they see creeping socialism, and they see us heading towards Soviet-style control and domination and misinformation. So when I talked about Sweden and the EU, you have these so-called bureaucrats in Brussels who were not elected, who are nonetheless regulating, and they're not accountable to the people. And there are those who see some very dark strains in the way in which the EU is going about unifying Europe and regulating and restricting the people of Europe. So I'm not seeking to come down definitively one way or the other. I'm just describing that, at a single state level, you have something like Sweden where you can see it actually works really well. But then when you aggregate that up, some of the weaknesses and the flaws metastasize.
Especially in the integration with the other unit that may or may not be compatible, right?
Yeah, in the sense that somebody's going to try to control that incompatibility and force unity against the will of the participants.
Yeah. Yeah, this is really interesting times we live in. I think from your perspective, I think you would advocate towards more of a spiritual re-enlightenment. I would say, is that the case?
Absolutely. However, I'm very conservative when it comes to morality. And that terrifies a lot of those people who are on the other end of the spectrum. So if we were going to regulate, I would be more inclined to start regulating morality, which is behavior, but I would not be inclined to regulate beliefs or expression of opinion and differences. So I believe, for example, personally, that science is a discipline that is in its infancy. It's a very powerful discipline. It is a necessary discipline. It is a beautiful evolution of human consciousness. The ability to think abstractly, detach, view an issue dispassionately, get multiple opinions, people looking at all sides of it and not trying to force the answer. In theory, science is beautiful. But the more complex the problems, we see this with supercomputing, the more complex the problems, the more difficult it is to get the computing power to handle it. And so it is with science and some of the big issues, the subtle biases of science, and there are biases inherent because we're all human, and it's basically children and babies trying to play with this new tool called science. Those flaws and weaknesses again get aggregated up and cause major distortions. And so, yeah, science is a great tool, but we're not wielding it very well yet. And the minute people start referring to the science in soundbite format, it's nothing more than the high priests, purveying their dogma.
Interesting. Okay, well, now your comment about your particular faith and the people of the sign, and I want to tell you about. I mean, it reminds me of a Jewish narrative, right? As being the chosen people or God's people. Do you see similarities between the Judaic faith and your faith?
Well, first of all, it's, The People of the Sign is the title of the first book. That book ends in 1995 with me resigning from the ministry of the group of which I was a part. So nobody should be confused for a second that whatever beliefs are represented in the book, The People of the Sign, are the beliefs that I today hold.
Right.
So, but you're very perceptive, because the beliefs that I held at that time were a kind of reverse Messianic Judaism. And what I mean by that is Messianic Judaism is Jews that have accepted Jesus, Jews that have recognized that Jesus was the Messiah that their religion, predicted.
Oh, interesting.
And while that's not entirely true, and I won't take the time right now to explore it, in my humble opinion, it's not entirely true. It's great because I believe that religion is progressive, and there was a progression from Moses to Jesus. And so it's a great thing that a Jew would recognize Jesus simply for the matter that it was a progression of their own religion. Forget whether they become Christian or not. They should recognize their own teachings in the teachings of Jesus. The Old Testament says that he would come to magnify the law and make it honorable. That's in the book of Jeremiah. The Messiah would magnify the law and make it honorable. The Jewish faith, as you've just called out, is viewed as dishonorable because they would lay this claim to being the special chosen people. That's dishonorable today. Do you disagree? That is a thing to be shameful, to declare that you are the special chosen people of God. You follow me? That is just passé, to put it mildly. It's certainly not woke.
Well, yeah, but I don't know. It doesn't. So here's just an intuition. I'm really on the outside, on the peripheral.
Absolutely.
And I don't. I'm indifferent to it, and not in a bad way. I think I'm fine with it, actually.
I'm glad to hear that, because I'm not saying it should be dishonorable. I'm saying that much of the trauma in the Middle East is around that perception that the Jews are somehow appropriating something inappropriate to themselves by their claims, even as to why they would claim the land as theirs, in that their book says that God gave it to them, for example. But my point is we're off point of my book, which is great, but we got to get back to it to clarify something. The sign is specifically the seventh-day Sabbath. So when I said we were sort of reverse Messianic Jews, we were Christians who saw Jesus as a Jew.
Yeah.
And who did not see Jesus as making a clean break with Judaism. When it says he would magnify the law and make it honorable, what in that verse indicates that the law would be abolished? Nothing. No. Nothing. Mm-hmm. But Christianity, certain major portions of Christianity, major denominations, would say that the law was, quote, done away, unquote. That the law was, quote, nailed to the cross, unquote. They would quote Jesus in various ways and claim that he had made a clean break with Judaism. And then they would, their practices would be Easter and Christmas, which are not Jewish. We did not keep Easter and Christmas. We kept Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Passover, because that's what Jesus said to do. Jesus said, here, take this bread. He broke it and he said, this is the testament. This is my body. This is my blood. And he was obviously referring to the Passover lamb. No secret there that the Jews took at Passover. And he said, do this in remembrance of me, which is where we get to Easter. Except that Easter is not that. Easter is a celebration of his resurrection, not his death. So we said Easter is a violation of the teachings of Christ. He taught us to keep the Passover with New Testament symbols. So we kept the Passover with New Testament symbols. We took the bread and the wine at Passover, and we celebrated Passover, not Easter. And he said, the day of your death is better than the day of your birth. There's no indication anywhere that we should ever celebrate his birth. He never gave any instructions that indicated it would be a good thing to celebrate his birth. So we didn't celebrate his birth. We did what he told us to do, which is to celebrate his death, which is what the Jews did symbolically in prophecy. So all of the Jewish holy days looked forward to the Messiah. We accepted Jesus as the Messiah, and so we kept the Jewish holy days.
That's really interesting, and I know we can kind of just to temper it a little bit, to say, yeah, we can totally come back to your book, but there's an open sort of invitation, and we're doing this on a monthly basis, so I find this really interesting, and I don't mind exploring it. For the balance of the episode.
No, but my only point was right up there on the top of the screen is the people of the sign, which is the title.
Right.
I had to explain what the sign is. The sign is the seventh-day Sabbath. Because we kept the seventh-day Sabbath, we kind of laid claim to being the true Jews, which is horrible. Frankly,
it kind of gets someone's back. That's interesting, right?
But my apologies to all my Jewish friends. It's what we believed. We believed that, but we loved the Jews. We loved their faithfulness and their obedience to God, and we loved them as people as well. But in terms of the religion, we loved that. But we felt that we had affinity with them and tried to keep the laws that they also tried to keep, but we felt that we had an enhanced understanding of what the purpose was of all those things that they were doing. We understood the fulfillment and the meaning of some of the rituals and traditions that they had.
Right.
That was just where we were at. And I'm not saying that was right or wrong, because I do want to distance myself to some degree from some of the beliefs I had, because I have grown to see some of the flaws in those beliefs, even though some of them I would say today, I could easily defend them from the Bible.
Interesting. Well, I've talked about this on numerous occasions, and the idea, just a rough heuristic about the Judaic faith versus the Christian faith, is that the Christian faith seems to internalize, embody the ideal of, in the form of Jesus, the ideal human being, right? So you internalize a lot of what he represents. Now these are broad brushstrokes, like you said earlier. The Judaic faith is much more on laws and following practices and protocols. And so I find it really interesting that there's even a religion out there that synthesizes the two. And do you find that you have to give up a lot of Judaism to allow that kind of internalization that manifests through the love of and the embodiment of the Jesus figure?
I don't believe so at all. I believe, and this is now this is my current set of beliefs as a Baha'i. I am a Baha'i today in my belief system. I've declared myself to be a Baha'i. I identify with the Baha'i faith and its teachers. One of the aspects of the Baha'i faith is an understanding of this progressive nature of revelation. But also that Moses and Jesus both brought pure water from God. There's the example of Moses striking the rock and water gushing forth in the desert. And Jesus referred to that and said, I am the rock from which that water flowed. And he said, you will also have rivers of living water flowing through you. The the pure water was brought by Moses and Jesus, and there's no difference in the purity of that water. The religions that were established became muddy ponds. And in fact, the analogy I like to use is, let's say it was a pretty clear lake. Let's say it was Lake Tahoe even, which is a very clear lake. But then some of the priests and leaders would like cordon off a kiddie pool next to the lake and start, charging money to access it and sell portions of it. And as you approach the kiddie pool, like I did with my 3-year-old daughter a few years ago, all you can smell is pee and chlorine. You know what I mean? It's no longer pure water. And that's kind of the way religions become over time, through the handling of it by the people who are seeking to practice it. But the water that came was pure. And what's fascinating is the divine progression. And this may be hard to swallow for those who don't accept a God, but I'll just share my beliefs. The divine progression was that Israel was, Moses came at a time to show Israel what a pure city state should look like, versus the Egypt that Moses and the Israelites came out of, where they were the slaves. They were enslaved in Egypt, doing the will of Pharaoh. And Moses took them out of Egypt and gave them laws that would create a free and independent people, but in a small, tiny postage stamp of land situation. But here we go. That's the aggregation. Then the 50 states of America should have that same kind of freedom and independence based on the laws of Moses. So it's not surprising that you have America based on the Judeo-Christian teachings, because that was the pure water that Moses brought to build this little city-state with pure laws. And he said, the people from around the world will come and marvel at you, and they will say, what a wise people with such profound laws. And King Solomon and his glory is the epitome of that fulfillment. But Israel didn't follow the laws. They disobeyed. It's funny, this is a little fun tidbit. The first time Jews are mentioned in the King James Bible, the Jews are at war with Israel. And the reason is there's a northern and a southern kingdom of Israel, and Judah was the southern tribe under King David, and that was the Jews. And the northern kingdom of 10 tribes, that was Israel, and they were at war with each other. And first Israel went into captivity, and then the Jews went into captivity. The Jews, Judah, they held on to the teachings, and so they remained a people. They didn't disappear into history as the 10 lost tribes did. But today you have a Jewish state, but you don't have a temple. And the entire world of Islam, among others, denies the legitimacy of the state of Israel, because they don't want, and this is an oversimplification, but because they would say, well, it's not in the sense of Iran being an Islamic state and other Islamic states that practice the teaching of Islam. They would say that Israel doesn't do that because Israel doesn't have the temple and it doesn't have the priests. It is not fulfilling its purpose, or it's not fulfilling its calling, its commission, partly because it got taken into captivity. And for the really esoteric people, I don't know if you've ever heard of the red heifer and the search for the red heifer, so that once that's found, they can establish a temple and fulfill these biblical, ideals. I'm way off track now, and I'm sorry, there's just way too much detail here. But the point is, Moses came to help the people establish a city-state. Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight. So there are many breaks between Judaism and Christianity, but that's probably one of the biggest ones, is that Christians were not called to build any kind of political entity. So it's kind of funny in a way that you have many more Christian nations that declare that that's what they are, when that is not what Jesus came to do at all.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And so you have this really, and I could go on and on and on about this now, diving into arcane theology and what the Bible actually teaches and what it actually means. But it would be way too deep into rabbit holes I
Yeah.
don't mean deep in the sense of profound, but way too deep into rabbit holes for the purposes of this
We might
podcast.
have to start another episode, and we can start thinking about the title for that one.
Yeah, well, but the title would be "Six People on Earth Are Interested in This."
Yeah, and we got 2 of them online right now. That's it.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
4 more people.
So we should maybe get out of some of those rabbit holes and broaden it out a little bit.
Yeah, let's focus back on your journey, and where you're at as a. Let's go back to your childhood as a young man infiltrating into the culture of the United States again, and let's kind of pick it up from there.
Yeah.
How did you transcend your anger?
That's a great question. So what happens is, we talked about this naive, view of Sweden as this idyllic protective state. So I show back up in the middle of 6th grade. Not only am I outed as the Swede in the classroom, like I'm not Swedish, I'm an American boy, which I wasn't because I was born in Canada and I did not have American citizenship at that time. Again, I didn't know what I was, but anyway, these kids. So in school in Sweden at that time, the kids sat and they listened to the teacher, and the teacher ruled with an iron hand. I mean, it was a kinder, gentler version of control, but it was control. And now I come to America, and the kids are running around the classroom. They've got colored chalk. They're drawing all over the chalkboard, and they're drawing these symbols and words that made me uncomfortable. They had like this circle with like a Y in it. And I didn't know what that symbol meant and why they were drawing it on the board. And it was frightening. And they would write love. And why are these kids up writing stuff on the board and running around the classroom and making noise and not listening to the teacher? And it was scary, to be honest. And getting accustomed back to the language, and I was an outsider and all this. But there was also this overtone of drugs in 6th and 7th grade back then. And kids they were warning us about, narcotics and the dangers thereof and stuff. And I'd actually heard about this in Sweden, and I had no interest in it. But now all the kids were like talking about dabbling in it. And so me being wrapped around the axle and with all these hurt, anger and whatever, and what happened next was, I was now living with my mother, who was an alcoholic, and that fell apart, and I ended up in an orphanage. And then I was lied to by the authorities, and sent back to live with my dad in Alaska. And by now I had identified my dad as the source of all the things that I didn't like in my life. So I hated him. And my anger became directed at him. And this led to teenage rebellion. And the next thing you know, I'm deep into drugs. And that shaped the next phase of my experience of, being involved in things that were dangerous and illegal, including, getting involved in selling them and getting involved in people that, at levels way over my head in the drug world where that was dangerous, as well as the risk of being caught. And ultimately, not directly related to the drugs, but I was in a high-speed chase with the police in pursuit, where I ran off the road at over 100 miles an hour. That was the next phase of my life. And the way in which I got over that anger was literally plotting the murder of my father. And there was a kid that I knew, wasn't a close friend, but I knew him well enough, who at age 15 shot and killed his father. His father was a drunk and had assaulted his mother, laid down on the couch, fell asleep, and Eddie took a gun and put it to his father's head and pulled the trigger. And the mitigation of his circumstances, may have somewhat protected him. Plus he was a minor, but I was wanting to do it in cold-blooded, premeditated, and I couldn't figure out a way to get away with it. But I was working on that problem. and my life was spinning down, into a very dark place at age 16. But it was at that time where this law of Moses, the fifth commandment, honor your father and your mother. This is the first commandment with a promise. It says, honor your father and mother, that your days in the land that the Lord thy God giveth thee will be long. This is the first commandment with a promise. And I realized that I wanted to claim that promise. My mom died when I was 16. She was 35. You can do the math on how old she was when she had my older sister. And I realized I didn't want to end up like her. And so I decided to claim that promise, which meant I had to honor my dad and stop trying to kill him. But this is again, tidbits of the book. This is the interesting part of the book, that it raises these questions that they're germane to everybody, but they're raised in such a crazy, exaggerated, fantastic way that for many people, the book really works, right? That first book. Many people have told me, and I wrote it to beg all kinds of questions that we're addressing here in directly or obliquely, without giving any answers or without posing those questions directly. And I'm always fascinated when I meet somebody who read, especially the first book, and they say, what I really loved about your book was X. And I'm like, really? I would never in a million years thought you would get X out of my book. But they did, and that proves that I wrote the book I wanted to write, because I wanted them to get the answers and the reflections that were meaningful to them. And who am I to have any clue what you need, or what direction your life should take, or what question you should have answered, or what the answer is to that question that you have? That is not my place to even pose a hypothesis about what that should be. You follow me?
Yeah.
But when somebody comes and tells me your book meant so much, I got this out of it, I mean, that's the greatest praise anybody could ever give me. And I get it repeatedly, and it's never the same, and it always kinds of shocks me, and raises questions.
So Wade, I think you're a great storyteller. I mean, I'm going to read your book. I think it's kind of a must. I mean, but you have you thought about narrating the book? Like, would that make sense? Is it told in such a way that your voice would add something to it? Do you think?
Absolutely. I am. I'm toying with the 10th anniversary edition. I've got an editor who really wants to help me take the story to the next level, to take it above what has amounted to a cult hit, pun intended. If and when I get that project done, yes, I do plan to narrate the book as an audiobook.
Yeah. Because you're a great story, like you're and I think there's nobody that could verbally inhabit those words like I think you could. So I can tell right away that would be that would be a worthwhile project. If you want some help from me, I could I'd offer that as well.
Careful what you offer. You may get somebody taking you up on it.
Well, yeah, that's the thing, we can only hope, but it's like, it's a truism or whatever. It's like, good books choose you. And I know it's a little cliche, but, it's you sometimes you let, you let those choices, take you, right. And see where it goes.
Well, I have nothing in any of the religious texts that I've studied that indicates that this fantasy I'm about to share is true. But I have this feeling that some part of our soul chooses the next leg of our journey. And if there's any truth to that at all, we somehow chose the place and the circumstances that we parachuted into on this planet. That there's some element of choice involved, even in our very existence.
Let me ask
circumstances of our existence.
Yeah, let me ask you about that. I guess it's like that direction that we're being pulled. Is it? It seems there's a popular discussion in contemporary thought about psychedelics and recreational drug use. The reason why I bring that up is that first of all, what are your feelings about that? And number two, does it dull in that sense that you just talked about, that spirit pulling direction, or
Yeah.
um,
I would say this, especially given that I have both experiences of drugs and religion and spirituality. My current belief system and the teachers that I follow clearly say that opiates destroy the soul.
mm,
Um, and my answer as to how that is or why that is it's a short circuit, right? And just like the way in which a short circuit keeps the light from being, illumined, um, we might think that that shortcut or that short circuit of attaining spiritual awareness, is helpful, but ultimately it's not.
mm,
And I actually, one of the reasons I started taking drugs is I was captivated by the idea that it was somehow enlightening. Right, this came from the music of the Beatles, which is featured in my books. And they were such powerful personalities, and they were doing it, and everybody I looked up to was doing it, and in the 60s, and um, they were somehow proclaiming that this was a good thing, right?
mhm.
But it's a trap. It's a short circuit. It doesn't lead you to spiritual awareness. It
Yeah.
leads you it leads you to eclipsing that light. And interestingly, in next week, I'm kicking off an initiative with the Multi-Faith Clergy Council of South Central Wisconsin called Sacred Texts Study. And this is, different religious groups getting together and choosing to study a sacred text together. And
Mm,
I kind of hinted at this over meetings over the last couple of years, and others, I think, accepted that it would be a good thing to do this. And then I volunteered to do it, and they thought I was a good one to start it. And I plan to actually cover a few verses from Genesis in which God says he set the greater and lesser lights in heaven to rule the night and the day. And there's a difference between night and day in that in the night you don't have any direct sunlight, you only have the reflection of it. But you still at least have the reflection of it at night, but you don't have the direct light. So to the degree that the moon is a perfect mirror, which it's not, you have reflection. To the degree that
mm,
it's not a perfect mirror, you have some distortion of the light, but it's still good light versus darkness, right? And the point is, what does that mean? The light rules the night and rules the day. And why is this the opening verses of the Bible when it says God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and then He set these two great lights in heaven? And my main point here is that the path to enlightenment is to turn to the light. You simply turn to the light and you turn away from darkness. And unfortunately, those drugs and those opiates, they lead you to darkness, not to light.
interesting. Well, again, I'm going to volunteer to. I'd love to film that or put that in a recorded session. So please, talk to your group, and if I can get involved with something like this, then let's
Well,
talk.
yeah, no, I think I'm not. I don't want to rock the boat by suggesting that with this group. They've already said this is a private thing. We're not inviting others not in our group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but this, I've been meaning to launch this Bible study circle with people from different faiths, and I've actually put it off until after this kickoff of the Sacred Text Studies with the South Central Clergy Council of the Multi-Faith Clergy Council of South Central Wisconsin. So once I do that, I'm going to kick off this other, with the same kind of topic. And since I'm the leader of that, we could certainly have that filmed or recorded. And
Yeah, I mean, my son right now is going through the the Old Testament in a reader's version of the book. I think so. It's spaced out like a story. He can digest it a lot easier. It's just very interesting, and there's a lot of stuff right now that's on the internet about this material, and I think there's a hunger for it. And from a philosopher standpoint, the wisdom is something that I'm interested in. Right.
Yeah. So, either there is a divine being and there's really something utterly unique and powerful in it, or it's simply the collective wisdom of that age. Either way, it's worth studying.
I could say there's even something a little bit different added to that too, is the collective wisdom of that age, but transcended across culture, which is multi-generational, and so it doesn't reduce that secondary characterization, right? And so that's maybe the thing that the secular communities and atheists on the far end of the spectrum really, I guess, negate.
I don't know how much time we have, but I'd like to circle back, since we've gone down this particular path, and share something that is a thread in my book, especially really begins to come to fruition in the third volume, but the groundwork is laid in the first two. And that is something that ties back into the fear that some have of socialism and why. Okay. And that is the Tower of Babel, which is a story from the book of Genesis, in which mankind was one, united of one language. So you see the seed of the United States of America, in which people from all over the world came and learned one language. You see the seed of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which is something similar in the East. They all had to learn Russian, whether they wanted to or not. When I traveled in the East Bloc countries, I would always start with German, because that's where I was living, and then I would go to English, and if they didn't speak either of those, I would try French and Swedish, and then finally speak the language that I knew they spoke, which was Russian, because none of them wanted to talk Russian. None of them wanted to identify as Russian, right? In Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary. My point being, the Tower of Babel is the symbol of mankind being one, but the thing is, God came down, viewed it, and said, this is evil, and he didn't want it, and he confused the language and scattered the people because he didn't want them to work together. And from the city of Bab-el, which Nimrod built, which means the gate of God, you get the Tower of Babel, which God says is confusion. The pun here. It's not the gate of God, it's confusion. But then you have, from Babel, you have Babylon. And then from Babylon, you have Babylon the Great in the end time book of Revelation, and you have the mark of the beast, and you have the dragon, you have the four horsemen of the apocalypse, you have hunger, famine, death, destruction. You start doing the math, and 90% of humanity is wiped out by the end of that book. That is what people fear, because they equate maybe the European Union with Babylon the Great. And others have equated America with it, because the twin towers of the World Trade Center, in the minds of some, symbolizes Babylon. Babylon the Great is fallen as those twin towers symbolizing global trade fell. And when you read about Babylon the Great, it's all about the merchants of the world committing fornication with the kings, and so there's all this swirl of stuff in all this vivid imagery. And conservative people of a religious background are trying to figure out what this is telling us and what they should interpret and believe. And I'm not coming down on any one side of any of that here right now. I think it's worth exploring, but much of the fear is coming because in America you do have this thing called the religious right, which then morphed into the Tea Party, which then morphed into the supporters of Donald Trump. But at the core, you have the deep-seated religious beliefs of half of America that is seeking to interpret its world through the lens of those ancient writings and what they mean, because they hold to the Bible as the source of God's truth and revelation, even for this day and age. And it's a swirl.
Yeah, I think if you're following the thread of the story of Babel and the fall of Babel, to make distinct groups, to make them distinct and stay away from any mass unification narrative.
Right.
We
And
would,
what are we working with towards with the United Nations and with the European Union and a new world order and a global order? It evokes these things. And what kind of a world order is it? And is it a godless world order, i.e., one that would be equated with the confusion versus the gate of God? Because Nimrod was building the tower to glorify himself, not to the glory of God. So it's all well and good for Americans to say, well, one nation under God. But then when you create a world superstate that casts God aside and sets itself up above God, now you get into biblical texts where that's Lucifer, who ascended to the throne of God and tried to make himself equal with God, and he was cast down to earth with a third of the angels, and that's where you get the demons from, right? So I get that in a modern enlightened world that is, perhaps agnostic or even atheistic or anti-God, anti-religion, all of these things are viewed of as the horrible enemy that is deceiving people and keeping them, you know, uh,
yeah.
tied up in the wrong direction and getting caught up in all kinds of wrong things. So you have these forces between the peoples, and what can reconcile them?
Well, I mean, you take it on a really, really, interesting directive, but I'm saying, or direction, but I'm saying, if the wisdom in this is, even from a secular standpoint, is not to have a grand narrative superstructure, is to have smaller communities, and they could be godless communities. I'm not saying, at least in the way that you're describing it. From a Platonic standpoint, I refer to Plato a lot and say, well, it's the goodness in itself. And so, I kind of joke to myself and I say, well, from a Christian perspective, a Christian God perspective, it's like we forgot about the good. We've turned the goodness into an actual being, as opposed to leaving it just as good, right? It's good enough being good. We don't need to have embodiment figure, but somehow we need to do that.
I could not agree with you more. I would put it this way: what you profess to believe doesn't hold a candle to what you do. It's what you do and how you act, not what you believe, that matters. And so can we agree that there are deeds which are objectively good and deeds which are objectively bad, regardless of the belief system of the person performing that deed?
Well, and this is where the philosophical exercise comes in. It you have to look at the individual in a proximal and a distal relationship and realize that there's a proximal imagination of abstract thought that does perceive of the good, and then there's the group that also perceives of the good. And so this force of the good that has this constant back and forth through the individual. We're a eusocial species, and I'm not leaving any. I'm not moving. I'm completely in biology here, right? There's nothing outside of biology that I'm invoking. Is that we are a eusocial species, and we are responsive. It's almost like there's not enough language to describe what that interaction is between the individual and the group, right? But there's these proximal, I see it as we have these proximal and distal relationships between the abstract thought that we have and then the group and what the group is actually transmitting back to us. And then that transcends history and time and space in a way that's cultural, right? But if you wipe, here's where the secular sensibility comes in. If you wipe the human species off this planet, there is no God. There's no conception of it. This helps us. This is our creation. And that's the way I look at it.
Well, so If a tree falls in a forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? If there's no humanity, it certainly doesn't matter to humanity whether there is a God or not a God.
And that's a perfect way to end it on but that's really great. I like that. This is, I like these if you start bringing these kinds of conversations into our monthly meetings, they're too tempting for me to.
Wonderful.
I can't stay away from that. They're too tempting, Wade.
I really appreciate it. I mean, I think we're just beginning to peel off the first layer of the onion of these discussions.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Okay, appreciate it. Stay happy, healthy, and until next month, we'll see you later.
Bye now.
Bye.